Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks everybody for joining us today for the start of the 14th Annual Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, hosted by the Composting Association of Vermont and the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm Natasha Duarte, the Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I would like to take a minute to thank A&R for their continued partnership and especially for their support and flexibility as we navigated the postponement and new format for VORS this year. And I'd also like to thank my board of directors for their input and support through all the changes, and especially in organizing VORS as a webinar series instead of the traditional in-person event. I'd also like to take a minute to thank our sponsors who also hung in there as we sorted ourselves out. The Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLabs Technologies, Community Bank, Eco Products, Nature Cycle, Rich Earth Institute, Simplicity Engineering Solutions, the Trade Council of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, and Vermont Natural Ag Products. So thanks again to all of those folks for helping make this webinar series possible. Just a little plug for the full schedule. You all should have received the links for the full complement of webinars. So please go ahead and tune in to some of the other ones as they align with your interests as the week progresses. And now on to today's program. Even though VORS is being held as a webinar series this year, today's session is similar to the program that we usually provide in the plenary session in person. So Commissioner Walke is going to start us off with some opening remarks. He was named DEC Commissioner in February 2020 after serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources since 2017. Commissioner Walke, if you'd like to unmute and join us, that would be great.
Great, thanks Natasha. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. It's not quite the same as being all together, but we're all figuring out how we do this and trying to make the most of these opportunities. These are the types of events that are really critical for bringing knowledge together and sharing those resources with all of us. We all have a lot on our plates and not enough time to do all of the things that we're trying to do. And so it's really a wonderful moment to be able to come in and share these resources and learn from each other. It's a pretty momentous year and timing for this. Obviously, we're a month and 2 days into the full organics ban going into effect. So that's an exciting moment. It's a challenging moment for all sorts of reasons. It also happens to be, the highest bear year we've seen in a while, and people kind of learning and talking about that and kind of as we're fully implementing the law. But I'm really excited to be here with all of you. There's obviously a lot of discussion about the ban and going into effect in the legislature this spring, and ultimately we ended up where we are, and for the most part, my hats are off to Kathy and Josh and team for really doing a really wonderful job of answering questions and helping folks understand the law and work to implement it. It's never going to be without its bumps and bruises along the way, but we'll ride that out, and I think people will adopt composting and other things, just like we've seen with recycling laws and other things going into effect previously. So really excited. They did it in part because they heard from all of you. They heard from composters. They heard from solid waste management districts. They heard from haulers. They heard from the food bank. They heard from all sorts of things around, all sorts of you over the years, and your commitment to this process and making it work has been really impressive, and we're greatly appreciative. We at the DEC are working to continue to make progress. We're excited to see the advancements that have been made in terms of developing out infrastructure to support the composting world, as well as sort of to fill in the gaps in coverage around the state to make sure it's as easy as for people as possible. So thank you again for your assistance there. We have for a long time have been an organization that has focused on the water health of the state of Vermont, and solid waste fits so well into that mission. Water quality has been front and center as Vermont's water resources are rich. And it's really wonderful to have the sort of the bright spots of the work we do in the solid waste world to really stand out. We are going to be in challenging, as you all are as well, economic times in the next couple years as we all learn to understand what the result of the economic downturn will be on our ability to support critical programs. And I'm just grateful to the fact that we come together as a partnership to work through these issues so that not one of us is having to do it alone. And that the Vermonters have stepped up and are working to meet the law, and we look forward to that continuing. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Josh more about what the sort of state of the state is relative to the full implementation of the law, and understanding kind of where we are and any stressors that we might hear. I'm really grateful for this participation and to be able to be here with you all today. I wish I could be here throughout, but I'm really grateful for everybody to be here. So thank you very much. With that, I would hand it to Josh.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Walke. Josh Kelly is the Materials Management Section Chief for ANR Solid Waste Program. He joined ANR in 2013 and works with a team to implement Vermont's recycling, composting, product stewardship, and waste reduction initiatives. Josh will be talking to us today about the state of organics.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Commissioner Walke, for being with us. Yeah, it's a little bittersweet not to be with you all in person. VORS is an event we look forward to every single year, and hanging out at the BTC campus. But thanks everybody for joining nonetheless in the middle of a pandemic. Right staring us in the face as we actually just passed the last milestone of the Universal Recycling Law, the food scrap ban of 2020. And I am still a little shocked to be here at this moment. Having worked on it for about 8 years, came on to DEC just after the legislature had passed the law in early 2013 or mid 2013. And it has been my distinct pleasure and honor to work with all of you on this implementation and rollout that is really showing what Vermont is capable of. And hopefully I'll be able to talk just a little bit about that. But I want to be honest, our data is not yet in. I mean, we're only a month in, and I'm just kind of spinning from media requests most of the time. So anyway, without further ado, let's jump into it. So yeah, July 1, 2020, Vermont's food scrap ban takes effect, and it definitely a very momentous event and something we're still working through, but I've been very impressed by what people have been doing in our solid waste district community, our composting community, the hauling community, and really residents in general and businesses in general. It's been extremely impressive to see people engage. But let me just go through a little bit of how we got here, because it's the why is so much important, and I often skip past it on what the current status is. So folks are probably familiar with this slide. This graph is one we use to track waste in the state on an annual level. We are right now compiling the 2019 disposal and diversion numbers. We call it the annual D&D report. The two measures that we use most frequently are our annual D&D numbers that come from solid waste facilities, where they report to us what they took in and what amount of materials they processed. And then we have every 5 years the waste composition study, where we hire somebody to look through Vermont's MSW, municipal solid waste, and find out what's in it. We had that last study was in 2018, by the way. We'll have some data from that next. But as you can see, we've had a goal in the state for a 50% diversion goal. Basically, the shorthand of that is a recycling goal. So it's the amount of materials of the amount of materials that we produce as waste or that we don't need anymore, we're seeking to recycle or compost at least 50% of that, and ideally to reduce waste overall. And the trends that you're looking at here are in the last couple of years, again, this data is through 2018, an increase in waste generation, and that tends to trend with a good economy is a higher development, higher increase in waste disposal. But it obviously with things with COVID right now, we've seen some initial shortfalls in waste, not quite as severe as 2008, 2009, but definitely some decreases. But as waste goes up, we've also seen recycling tonnage and composting tonnage go up. But we're at around 35% currently for our current diversion rate. And for over a decade, we've had this goal, Vermont has had a goal of a 50% diversion rate. So that's where the law was put in place to target recyclables and compostables or food waste, the two largest components essentially of Vermont's waste stream. And food waste alone is the single largest component. And that brings me to this waste composition study slide. So in 2018, we did have a study of Vermont's waste. This is MSW waste, so it doesn't include sort of contaminated soils or other types of waste like industrial waste that might be disposed of. But it's generally what we find in the trash. And in 2018, the estimate is that about 20% of our trash is food or food scraps. And that accounts for almost 77,000 tons a year of food waste. And about half of that is from the residential sector. So that's a reason why Vermont has a food waste ban, and people ask me that pretty constantly. To ignore the amount of food waste from the residential sector would be ignoring a huge portion of our waste stream. And I think as we all know, it's just a material that does not need to be wasted. We've calculated using the EPA's WARM model that if everyone was to compost their food waste in Vermont, it would be the same as taking over 9,000 vehicles off the road each year. And that's using that 77,000 tons in a comparison versus landfilling it. So I would just say that what we're seeing is that Vermonters know we can feed people and we don't need to feed landfills. And we're building soil and soil resiliency and conserving resources. This law. And that's what its purpose was, and that's what it's doing out there, and that's what you all are doing each day, day in and day out. I wanted to mention that Vermont is not alone. There are multiple states with organics bans, and those include California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, New York, and now most recently New Jersey. New York and New Jersey are probably the most recent Northeast states to join with a varying levels of organics ban. And obviously those are they're different. They're at the 1 or 2 ton food waste generator level. But I think more states are seeing that this just makes sense, and it often can make economic sense. So there's definitely a lot of activity in this space going on around the Northeast region. And that includes Vermont, and that includes some of our neighboring states as well. So back to July 1, Vermont state law now bans disposal of food scraps from both the trash and in landfills. And I get the question all the time, so what does that mean? You know, what does that look like with enforcement? And I want to remind folks that there's actually 11 disposal bans or landfill disposal bans in state law that the agency and Department of Environmental Conservation have enforcement authority over. And we have been very consistent with the universal recycling law from the beginning, from the get-go. With the recycling ban of 2015, we were very much focused on outreach and education leading up to that law. We have been working on compliance at the largest generator sector. That's where we do a lot of our outreach, a lot of our education resources go there. And we seek voluntary compliance in every case, trying to ensure that services are available so that when something is banned, there's hopefully an option for that person to do the right thing and separate that material from the trash. We don't pick through residents' trash bags looking for recyclables or food scraps. And it's just, it's not something we have time for or interest in. We're trying to move the needle on this law towards more and more reduction in waste, diversion of waste, increasing recycling. And it's happening. It's happening with all of you and with all of the Vermonters. I wanted to raise one thing because people ask me a lot of times about the rental housing health code, or what to do, how does this work in the rental setting? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to mention that because it is part of the Department of Health's rules. It's one of their rules is the Department of the Rental Housing Health Code. And it essentially does put obligations on landlords to ensure that there's appropriate receptacles for not only trash, but recyclables and food scraps. And you'll see this reference to statute 10 VSA, chapter 159. Those are the state laws that DEC oversees for the landfill bans. And that the owner of the dwelling needs to assure that arrangements are made for the removal of trash, recyclables, and food scraps. And in some cases, that could be an on-site composting bin. It doesn't necessarily need to be curbside hauling. And I will say straightforwardly that the Rental Housing Health Code does not specify who pays, which we often get complaints from tenants that I don't have this service, I want my landlord to pay for it. Well, it doesn't say who has to pay for it, just that it be available. So you probably, some of the solid waste districts and towns get questions about this. If you need help with this, please feel free to reach out to us at DEC. We've gotten a lot of questions. We've worked very closely with Department of Health on guidance on this topic, and we're happy to navigate these, sort of lacking in clarity issues. But we're trying to get people there, find a service that can meet their needs, and make sure that everybody has the three options in reach: either composting at home, using a drop-off, or working with a curbside hauler. So I don't want to miss that also on July 1, haulers of trash are now required to offer food scrap collection to commercial customers, basically non-residential customers, and apartments of 4 units or more, unless another hauler is willing to provide that service. This is obviously a mouthful just to read and confuses some folks. And so what we've sort of said to help haulers who are struggling with this is if they want to know, if a trash hauler wants to know if another hauler is serving their customers for food scrap collection, such that they themselves then don't have to offer it, we're happy to do that research for them. We talk to food scrap haulers fairly routinely to confirm their routes, confirm what services are provided in what towns, and we'd be happy to try and connect those parties to find out who, if a trash hauler doesn't want to, they can be assured that their customers have options. And bag drop haulers, just to note, are already required to offer food scrap collection. And that was as of 2017. It was made retroactive by some other legislation previously. I want to mention, though, that there has been a lot of activity we've seen in the permitting of new food scrap haulers. We've had, I'm going to guess, we've counted up about 9 in the past, 3 to 6 months, 9 new food scrap haulers. We currently have 28 total. And that's not including ones that are not listed on our voluntary Vermont food scrap hauler list. And that's voluntary. If anyone wants to be listed, feel free to reach out to us. We'll happily list them if they have a statewide hauler permit. But it has been definitely an uptick since July 1 took effect. And many have just signed up and started offering services right after July 1. So I think there's more services coming. And I want to mention that a few of the food scrap haulers I've spoken with have seen their business grow. I mean, one hauler told me their business had a 50% increase in 1 week, and somebody else had nearly 1,000 requests for signups right around the July 1st deadline. So there's definitely a lot of activity, a lot of demand. And we consistently at DEC, when we speak to customers, whether residential or business, we tell them to ask their current hauler if they provide this service. Ultimately, we want everyone to have an equal chance to offer the service, and the more services that are available, the better for everyone. So this is a map, I'm turning here to the state and where drop-off locations are in Vermont. So these are transfer stations primarily, as well as some of the composting sites, and including some non-certified farm composting sites around the state. And currently, Vermont has over 24 composting facilities at either the larger certified scale or even smaller on-farm scale. And we have over 100 drop-offs around the state, and most towns are within 10 miles of a food scrap drop-off. And from what we've been hearing anecdotally, some of these drop-offs are more activity with food scrap collection coming in. I know one district told me they have given out over 1,000 drop-off buckets, the 5-gallon buckets the residents use. So it has really impressed us that people have engaged with the July 1 ban so emphatically. And I know it has stressed some transfer station facilities, and our goal there is to work with them to get a good system in place, to have safe management of food waste, effective management of food waste. It cannot sit very long in the warm weather of August. So we're trying to work with people to get a good system in place. And where some maybe didn't see a lot of interest in it in the past, now there's definitely more customer demand for those types of services. I just wanted to highlight just one of these newer facilities that has come on board. Just as an example, I know my colleagues in DEC are working with almost a dozen different facilities on either new composting sites or expanded composting permits. And so there's definitely a lot of interest in everything from the small scale on-site composting, such as transfer stations deciding they want to start a composting, an active composting pile at the transfer station. That saves them in some cost for hauling for food waste, for example. And then others who are starting their own compost sites for the benefits that compost brings from farming and agricultural uses. So Sunrise was just one example of the folks we've seen engaging right around the July 1 date. And I get questions sometimes about, well, where's the capacity at? And we actually had some of these questions at the legislature this spring as there was discussion about the law. And so I put up this slide that we shared. We compiled this data in April of 2020. So it's probably out of date already because a lot of things have changed. But essentially, the left hand of the slide is looking at the tonnage of need. How much food waste processing, how much food waste is there going to be as a result of this July 1 ban? And we looked back at both our waste composition study of 2018 and the DSM systems analysis for the impact of Act 148 on solid waste. This was a study done in 2013. And with those numbers, we also looked at some of the recent survey data of what residential behavior is around food waste management. Like, what are people composting at home? Are they using a drop-off? Do they feed animals? That sort of thing. So the green bar is the amount of food waste that is projected to need a home, need management away from somebody's home. And the blue bar, you'll notice the blue stays the same all the way across. That's an estimate of home backyard composting or feeding animals. So that's projected to already be being managed before even 2020. So we're using a very conservative estimate, and certainly that has been growing since July 1 took effect. And then the green is the need on the left, and then the low capacity estimate of how much tonnage of food waste might be able to be handled by the facilities in the state, and then a high capacity estimate. And I think these are pretty conservative given that many facilities, again, are coming online to meet the demand, new facilities, and there's construction as we speak. I think there's a digester in Salisbury that I think is still under construction. I know many of composters are expanding and changing their pad size or their operations. And we have facilities around the state that have been expanding to meet this new demand. So just about wrapping up, Natasha mentioned it a little bit, the state has launched a Let's Scrap Food Waste campaign and website, and it also came with social media advertisements as well. If you haven't seen this website, if you haven't watched the video, I strongly encourage it. I assume most of you have, but I also want to point you to one of the newest parts that Ann Bajura has started to collect scrapbook stories, and pun intended there. So there's scrapbook stories of people's own experiences with food and food waste and how they manage it. And it's everything from Vermont's famous bear biologist, Forrest Hammond, talking about his tips for dealing with bears, to people who have curbside pickup or use a drop-off or compost at home, just all the different methods. And so when people ask me, well, what do you expect me to do? I've been telling them, check out the scrapbook, because you don't need to take my word for it. You can really see first-person accounts of how food waste is managed in Vermont. And this is some of the things that just impress me about Vermonters and the way that they're just really ingenious in the management and not wasting food as well. So another thing that happened July 1, and probably people noticed it, was the single-use products law also took effect, which, just as an FYI, has been keeping us very busy. Both of these laws happening on July 1st. And so this is the highlights of that law in its briefest points: that single-use plastic bags are no longer given out, and paper bags can be for a 10-cent fee at the point of sale for stores. So there's obviously a lot of change happening this summer in the midst of a global pandemic. And I just want to say extend my gratitude to all who work in solid waste for explaining things to folks, being patient, being extra patient at these times where I feel like as a population, we need to just have a deep well of empathy for each other. There's been sniping about who's wearing masks and who's not and why. And I've just been really pleased by just the Society of Vermont that's been caring for one another at this time. So there's a lot going on, and DEC is here for you. If you have questions, or if you get questions and want to send folks to us, please do. We're happy to take phone calls and emails, and we're still working. I just want to note the single-use products law is not a landfill ban, in case anybody gets confused. I've had haulers ask, well, can they throw away straws in the trash? I said, yes, you can. So lots of good questions coming in. And then I guess just lastly, for what's ahead for DEC, we have our new solid waste rules coming out. They're in draft form, and we all hope that those will be wrapped up hopefully soon in the next coming months. It does include a food scrap drop-off option for sort of a registration process to get a food scrap drop-off off the ground. And I will note that the rules do allow generators to share communal services, like at a mall. There are multiple generators that can use a trash dumpster. There are multiple generators that can use recycling dumpsters, and the same goes for food waste. So it is possible to share those things at a single location. And going back to rentals again, and rentals goes for businesses as well. Those can be tricky. If you need to call us for help, feel free. That's what we're here for. We're here to help people work through this. This is definitely new. And we find that when we give somebody some patience and some time, there's almost nothing that we can't figure out. So with that, I just want to say my thanks and my gratitude to all of you. I still cannot believe we're here at 2020. It just seemed like it would never come, and we did it. And we have a lot of work ahead of us. We're going to be starting up probably business outreach, COVID dependent, and that will probably be virtual sometime in the fall. We'll probably start looking to you all for anything you're dealing with, or questions you have, or priorities you have. And we're hoping to continue to support all of the good work everybody is doing. And again, to find the right management options for food waste. And that means talking through issues from bears to whether you need a curbside service, and if you're managing it on site, to have proper compost recipes, all of the above, because we need to make this work, and we need to show how this can be effective in our state. And you all are doing that each and every day. I couldn't be more grateful. Natasha, over to you.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next presenter, which is essentially our keynote address from Dr. Meredith Niles. Meredith is an assistant professor in the Food Systems Program in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at the University of Vermont. Her work examines the nexus of food, environment, and health with a focus on people, behaviors, and policy. Meredith's current research examines food waste behaviors and policy perceptions, farmers' adoption of sustainable practices, including those related to water, nutrient management, cover crops, and climate change impacts on food security. Her research spans from the eastern US to California, New Zealand, and many low-income countries in Africa and Asia. Meredith's work has been featured prominently in the popular press and media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, National Public Radio, and USA Today. And with that, Meredith, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you for the invitation for being here. Like Josh, I'm bummed to not be together in person, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my research, which really focuses on the human behavior, perceptions and behaviors around food waste in particular. So today I'm going to focus on that Vermont household food waste perceptions and behaviors. And seems like my slides, there we go. Before I started, I wanted to give a shout out to a group that I'm part of at UVM. It's the Recycling, Organics, and Resources group. We call ourselves ROAR. And on the screen, you can see the 3 founding members of this. Myself, focused on human perceptions, behavior, and policy around food waste and resource management. Deb Neer, who I believe is on the call today as well, who focuses on organics recycling, microbiology, and ecology, and Eric Roy, who's in nutrient management and engineering. And we founded ROAR to really help guide sustainable materials management with an idea in mind to minimize cost and maximize environmental benefits, and really to do that with considering the perceptions of communities, their participation and impacts. And so we are a consortium of researchers. It's not just the 3 of us at UVM. We have many other collaborators at UVM and beyond, and we're working a lot with industry groups as well as community partners on this research. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to be in touch with us if you have any questions about research or some of the work that we're doing. So my presentation mostly today, Natasha asked for me to really focus on the people side of this issue. And so really the 5 kind of areas that I'm going to focus on in particular are to elaborate a little bit more on what Josh said about why households. Why should we think about households as an important component of food waste? What do we already know about what people think of food waste, what their behaviors are, what their perceptions are? I'll talk a little bit more about the state policies that are in place and what they look like if they include a household level policy. And then I'm going to present some of my own research. I'll be presenting 3 different components of my research throughout the presentation, work that I've done with my ROAR collaborators, as well as a study that I led in 2018 that was just published this year, focused on Vermonters and food waste. And then I'm going to share just a snippet of some research that we've just hot off the presses from a survey that we conducted in March at the start of COVID-19 and how that is affecting people's food waste as well. And then I'm going to end with some conversation about the implications for 2020 and beyond in light of the work that I've done and what we know about human behavior. What do we need to keep thinking about? And more, it's a lot of questions back for discussion and for conversation, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that. So why should we focus our attention on the household? Well, as Josh noted, here in Vermont, household food waste is a significant portion, about half of all food waste that is in the waste stream. But even when we think about this sort of at a larger US level, there's research that has found that about 32% of all of the food that a household purchases annually is wasted. And this is fairly new research, so about 1/3. The estimates range a little bit, but they tend to be in that 1/3 range. And I'm sure we're all aware of the statistics around, in general, about 30 to 40% of all US food is wasted. And most of that is potentially edible. So the graphic here is from a more recent NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council report from 2017, showing the amount of food wasted in a household and whether or not it was edible. And so over half was typically edible, and up to 68% was edible potentially in some way. So it does suggest that there is, first of all, a lot of waste happening at the household level, but also that there's a lot of potential to reduce that waste because a lot of it is actually edible in some ways. And from work that we've done at UVM, this is research that we published in 2018, we also found that about a pound of pound of food per person per day is wasted at the household level. And this was covered very significantly in the national media. This is an article from the Washington Post that covered the research. But we also tried to not just quantify the amount of food that a typical person at the household level wastes, but also the impact of that on the environment from growing that food in the first place. So all of the food that we grow that gets wasted at the household level alone, we equated to being, in the United States, the equivalent of food grown on 30 million acres of cropland annually, produced with 4.2 trillion gallons of water, 1.8 billion pounds of fertilizer. And that's all wasted to produce food that we never actually eat. And so I think that these are really important environmental impacts to consider as we think about food waste reduction or food waste diversion, that just growing food to waste it or even divert it is still a significant cost to the environment. So what do we actually know about food waste behaviors? Food waste behaviors are a significant component of some of the work that's been happening in this space. So there's, over the last decade or so, quite a lot of research focused on understanding what are people's perceptions of food waste, why do they waste food, what are they doing about wasting food, what are the strategies to help people reduce their food waste. Quite a lot of this has focused initially in Europe. There's a growing amount of research here happening in the United States. And for the most part, all of the work I'm going to present today is US specific. So do people even really think that this is a problem? Do we have an education issue? And most of the research suggests that no, it is not that people aren't aware that landfill and food is a problem. And the vast majority of households know that food waste is a problem and that putting food in a landfill has environmental costs and other costs. But there are data suggesting that procedural and technical information to help people address the issue is lacking. So it's not so much that people need to know that they should stop wasting food or that food in a landfill is causing negative impacts. It's more that people need to better understand how to waste food less, how to do that well, and technical information that may help provide them with those resources. So for example, the difference between sell-by dates versus use-by dates. All of these more technical kinds of information are the kinds of things that give people additional information that helps them better understand the problem. So just telling people that food waste is a problem is not necessarily going to shift the needle on where things are, but providing more technical information and procedural information may be useful. We also know that in general, we all think that we're better than other people. And this is not necessarily a phenomenon just of food waste. It's a human problem in general. We all have a rosy glasses on for ourselves, but tend to see ourselves in better light than others. So for example, a 2015 study by Ronnie Neff at Johns Hopkins University, a representative US study, found that 3 out of 4 Americans think they waste less food than the average American, which even statistically isn't possible. But this is data from our most recent survey that we did here in Vermont in March, end of March 2020. It was a survey focused on food insecurity and COVID-19, but we wanted to ask people about a number of different household level behaviors that you can see here in the graphic. And so the blue bars are people's perception or stated whether or not their household had done these things. And the yellow bars are whether or not they believe that the average US household had done those things. And so you can see second down here, throw away less food. Well, in the end of March, early April 2020, 60% of Vermonters felt that they threw away less food at that point in time, whereas they thought that only 28% of average US households had thrown away less food since COVID-19. Conversely, down here at the bottom, throw away more food. About 2% of Vermont households said that since COVID-19, they've been throwing away more food, but 32% of those households thought that the average US household had thrown away more food since COVID-19. So even in our global COVID-19 pandemic, we still see ourselves in better light than maybe our neighbors or other people. And another thing that we know is there's growing evidence to suggest that when food is composted, we actually, or if it's going to be composted, we actually wind up wasting more food or at least not reducing food waste. So in a NRDC study from 2017, 58% of people said they felt less guilty about wasting food if they knew it was going to be composted. And in my favorite study that I found so far on this topic, published by a graduate student at Ohio State University, this is the press release from it. What they did was they used an intervention in a dining setting, and they provided people with information about the environmental impacts of food waste and the landfill impacts of food waste. And in that condition, people who had received that information had an 85% reduction in food waste. But when those people also got information suggesting that the food would actually be composted, there was actually no change in the food waste as compared to if they just got the information about the landfill. So there's an increasing amount of evidence suggesting that people are actually willing to waste the same amount of food, if not even more potentially, if they think that it will be composted, which I think is something really important for us to consider, especially in light of our new recent policy here in Vermont. So if the goal really is to waste less food, then how do we do that? So I want to talk a little bit about what policies or other strategies might be necessary. And I'm going to lead that off with an overview of some of the existing policies in other places, and then talk about some of our own research here in Vermont. So across the US, there's a number of states now, and in fact, this map doesn't even fully include all of the states, as well as municipalities that have implemented some level of organic waste bans or waste recycling laws. So some major cities like Austin, Boulder, Minneapolis, New York City, San Francisco, and Seattle. And then states, as Josh mentioned earlier, California, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I don't have New York on there, but New York is similar to New Jersey, Rhode Island, and then finally Vermont. So I thought I'd share a little bit about 5 other states and what they're doing, since Josh already covered the Vermont law, and I think many people here are familiar with that. So in California, the law covers any business, and it really goes down to 2 cubic yards a week of food scraps if a statewide organic waste disposal has not reduced waste 50% below 2014. So it's really covering, there's no sort of restrictions on the type of business that could be included, including individuals, if in fact they meet a certain size threshold capacity. In Connecticut, the policy covers commercial food wholesalers and food manufacturers, supermarkets, and resorts. And it has this phased in effect that many policies do that are being implemented, including what happened here in Vermont, where it covered large generators at 104 tons per year in 2014, but by this year we'll get down to 52 tons per year. And those people have to be within 20 miles of organic processing. Similar strategy in New Jersey, so large scale generators, anyone with 52 tons per year within 25 miles of organic processing. And in Massachusetts, the policy is more stringent in the sense that it covers also any individuals, businesses, or public municipalities, but similar, it's 1 ton per week, which is really the same as 52 tons per year. And it's only covered for the weeks that they meet the threshold. And then finally in Rhode Island, again, large scale facilities and a phased in effect here. So 104 tons per year in 2016, and then 52 tons per year, and within 15 miles of organic processing. So in general, a lot of the policies out there have a phased in effect. In general, they tend to affect large scale generators only. They could cover individuals, but for the most part, those people are not included because they aren't large scale generators. But then here in Vermont, as we've already talked about and Josh covered extensively, we have our universal recycling law that went into effect in July 1st. And I would like to say that, I think that right now Vermont is in a grand experiment. And I imagine that many of you on the call would agree with that. We have a lot of things that are different about Vermont and our attempts to implement this policy. And so, for example, and some of the motivating questions from my own research here has been to think about the unique characteristics of Vermont. So we are the second most rural state in the United States. And that has huge implications for hauling distance, for example, to pick up compost in rural places. But it also suggests that we do have capacity in many places for composting or disposal, feeding to livestock, et cetera. Vermont's also unique in its policy approach, as I think you all know, because it does cover the household level. So we are the first policy in the country to really go down to that level. And, the first place that really has this rural landscape at that level as well. So even the major municipalities that are doing this are working with economies of scale and working with urban concentration. So 3 of the questions that motivated the research that we did that I'll present more now are, how will Vermont households manage food waste? How are they doing it currently before the law, and how might that change after the law? What kinds of households are most likely to utilize certain strategies? And what is the future demand for composting pickup? And what are Vermont households willing to pay? So knowing that the policy had some of these requirements around hauling, and that was a major issue for many haulers, we wanted to better understand who are the households that might participate, what does the demand for that service look like, and are they willing to pay for that service as well? So I'm going to spend some time now presenting the results from this research. The methods for this survey, so this was questions that were added to the Vermonter poll, which is a statewide telephone survey that's been conducted by the Center for Rural Studies at the University of Vermont since the 1990s. These questions were conducted in 2018. A total of 583 Vermonters responded to the survey. You had to be 18 years of age or older, and it was a random sample. And the survey is largely reliable in the sense that it has a margin of error plus or minus 4.1%. And there are a couple of places where I might refer to urban counties. And for the purposes of this study, we use the US Census metropolitan area definitions for that, which classifies Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties as urban, even though I'm sure some of you may be tuning in from parts of those counties where you do not consider yourself urban. That was based on the census definition. So the first thing that we asked people about was if they'd even heard of Vermont's food waste law. This was again in 2018. And in 2018, we found that 71% of respondents were aware of the law, and that there was greater awareness among younger Vermonters in particular and homeowners as compared to renters. I think that last point is important considering what Josh mentioned as well about some of the health code requirements for rental properties in his presentation as well. When we asked Vermonters about whether or not they agreed that food waste should be banned from the landfill, 56% of respondents agreed to some extent that food waste should be banned from the landfill. And people that were more likely to have higher agreement with that had higher levels of education. Women compared to men were more likely to support the ban for food waste. Households that were currently composting, not surprisingly, and households using another sort of method of disposal of food waste, not using garbage, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So we asked Vermonters about their current waste strategies. This was in 2018, as well as their future intended waste strategies after the food waste law took effect. So here I'm showing you the current waste strategies, and respondents were allowed to indicate multiple strategies. And we found that 72% of respondents, again in this representative Vermont poll, indicated that they were managing their own food waste with backyard composting or feeding their food scraps to pets or livestock. And that was followed by 43% indicating that they put their food waste in the garbage, 22% using a garbage disposal, like an in-sink incinerator for garbage, 19% were going to a drop-off station, and around 11% subscribing to a curbside pickup program for food waste, similar to recycling. So we did find that most respondents only used 1 or 2 food waste disposal strategies, and the 2 most common of those together were people both using garbage and also managing their food waste with backyard composting or feeding to pets or livestock. So I do think that that is an interesting area for further exploration. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. but the fact that so many Vermonters were at least in some capacity feeding some of their food scraps to pets or livestock or composting is a great finding and has a lot of potential, I think, for understanding these impacts. So who are doing these strategies? Who were doing these things when we asked the questions? We found that rural households were more likely compared to urban households to be using backyard composting. Younger households were more likely as well to be composting or feeding to pets and livestock. And homeowners compared to renters were more likely to be composting as well. We found that renters were more likely to be using the garbage as opposed to homeowners, and households that weren't aware of Act 148 were also more likely at the time in 2018 to be using the garbage. And then among those that indicated they were using curbside pickup in 2018, larger households were more likely to be doing that. And interestingly, households without knowledge of Act 148, which was quite surprising to us. We would have expected the opposite, but it seemed to indicate that those households, the small number that were using this program, were doing so not necessarily in preparation for Act 148. So when we asked them about their future strategies, and I apologize, there's a typo here. This should say future waste strategies, not current waste strategies. So this is the responses of people telling us how likely after the food waste ban goes into effect, where we are right now in our moment in history, how likely would be people to use these different strategies. And so the blue bars are showing a combination of very or somewhat likely, and the light orange and dark orange are unlikely. So based on these results, 76% of Vermonters indicated after the food waste ban that they would be managing their food waste through backyard composting or feeding to pets or livestock. About 34% indicated that they would subscribe to a curbside pickup program. And the same number, 34%, indicated that they would throw their food waste into the garbage. I should add that is after we explained to them that the law would actually not allow them to do that, or that doing so would be going against the law. We still found that about a third of people didn't really seem to care necessarily, and were still going to throw their food into the garbage. A slightly smaller percentage indicated that they would go to a drop-off station, and then a smaller percentage, only about 20%, using a garbage disposal in their sink and in-sink incinerator. So who's likely to do these things in the future? So among those indicating they would be likely to compost in the future, we found that rural households would be more likely to do that. Younger households, homeowners, and larger households, and those with children. Who would be likely to use curbside pickup programs in the future? Two dominant categories here: renters, as well as urban households. And we found a sort of general finding that people stick with what they know. So overall, what people were doing before the law was generally what they said they would continue to do after the law, with the exception of people who were using the garbage. The major shift in categories between these different types of disposal options or repurposing options was really only a shift for people using garbage to go to something else. And in that case, they were shifting towards composting or curbside pickup in some cases. So related to curbside pickup, we asked our respondents, if curbside food waste pickup was available, how frequently would you want the pickup? Obviously, the frequency of pickup is an important topic for consideration for haulers, but also for things like bears and wildlife that people have been concerned about. And also, as Josh indicated, it's August now, and so not everyone really wants to have a month's worth of food waste building up, waiting for their pickup to happen. So overall, we found that 40% of people told us they wouldn't even use a curbside pickup program. And among those that indicated they would be interested in it, the most common frequency was once a week, followed by twice a week. And then some people indicating they wanted once a week in the summer, but they were willing to wait longer and do twice a month in the winter. And then a small percent said twice a month total. So among households among households that were more likely to use a curbside pickup program were those currently using garbage or an in-sink garbage disposal. Urban households, again, those in Chittenden, Grand Island, Franklin counties, households with children, and not surprisingly, people already using the service. So the good news of some of these results showed that people already using the service weren't going to stop using it. But the new customers that people might expect to have were primarily those focused in urban areas, households with children, and those currently using garbage. Households that were less likely to want curbside pickup were homeowners as opposed to renters, and those currently using compost as a disposal strategy. Now, the important question following that is, well, if you want curbside compost pickup, how much are you willing to pay for it? And unfortunately, especially for some of the haulers on the phone or on the call today, we found that over half of our respondents indicated they would be willing to pay nothing extra for the service. And a small percentage, about a third, indicated they'd be willing to pay up to $10 extra per month. I am curious to hear from those that are offering the service what those costs look like and whether that aligns at all with what we're seeing here. Higher willingness to pay for the service was associated with people with higher rates of education, children in the household again. So presumably you have a lot of extra stinky food waste if you have children. I have a 1-year-old myself, so I can appreciate that. And they want to potentially get it out of there quickly. Younger people in the household and people already using curbside compost appear to be reaping the benefits and realizing the benefits of it, and were willing to pay something extra. So just to summarize some of the key results, and then I'm going to move towards some broader implications for 2020 and beyond, and then I think we should have plenty of time for questions. So most of the respondents in our survey indicated that they already knew about the law, and the majority of them already support banning food waste from landfills. So as we're now in 2020, this is again data from 2018, but even in 2018, I think that suggested a positive trend that people were already aware of this, and they generally supported it. There was a significant gap in awareness in older Vermonters and renters especially, are an important group in this particular policy as we think about how to provide services for those populations. I think that's also complex because there's a lot of questions about who provides information to renters about this, whether it's the landlords or whether it's the haulers or whether there's someone else that should be playing that role. And as Josh indicated in his presentation, there is not necessarily a requirement that homeowners or landlords have to pay for a service. So there's also questions about the cost, I think, in rental facilities as well. Among the most interesting findings for us was that most of the respondents were already composting, 72% in 2018, and intend to do so in the future, 76% saying they would do so after 2020. I think that indicates a couple of things. First of all, there's no guarantee when we say, and in fact we know it's not true, that of those 72% of people in 2018 who said that they were using compost, it's very unlikely, if not improbable or impossible, that they were using compost exclusively. We know they weren't using compost exclusively. About a third of our respondents told us they were using compost exclusively. So that does suggest, though, an interesting potential to increase capacity for some of those households. So if some people were maybe just dabbling in compost or just like feeding a few things to their backyard chickens every once in a while, but they were willing to do it in some capacity, nearly 3/4 of Vermonters were doing it in some capacity, I do think that suggests there's great opportunity for many of the people on this call and other people interested in composting to expand the capacity people already have or the interest that people already have. And so I think there's wonderful opportunities for educational programs in that space. How do you get people from just throwing a couple bones to the chickens or to the livestock or the dog, but actually enabling them to fully compost all of their own food waste. So, things like the Master Composter program that UVM runs and others that I know are great resources for those people on the call today. I think this is an interesting space to expand that capacity. And then I think in the space of curbside pickup, the majority of respondents wanted the program, but they won't pay. And so I think that is a continuing challenge, and I'm looking forward to hearing conversation or questions about this, because really that is a key issue, I think, especially for this moment in time. You know, I'm really excited to hear from Josh's presentation that there is an increase in the number of haulers and potential business opportunities here. But it's a tricky thing to navigate, especially once you get the initial round of people signing up for something after a law takes effect, what we would call early adopters or even sort of middle adopters. But how do you get, you know, the group of people that may not be willing or able to pay that money to do so? And I do think it's worth noting that the people who were most interested in these programs and willing to pay, a good starting point for many of you, is in urban counties with renters, households with children, and people already using garbage. So adding on a service to their existing hauling options. But some broader implications, I think, to talk through and think about in this space. So, you know, I think that we need to be careful and talk more about some of the varying trade-offs that are inevitable in some of these policies and the implementation of these policies. So a rural state like Vermont has a lot of capacity to compost in many areas, but that does come with potential challenges and trade-offs. So for example, there are efficiencies of scale that have to be considered in many ways. This is a potential major challenge for haulers and for price-sensitive consumers. So driving a truck, yeah, I live in Lincoln, Vermont myself, South Lincoln, pretty rural out here. I can't imagine sending, you know, a waste truck all the way up to the end of my dirt road to pick up my small bucket of compost every day. So I think thinking about what might be the right opportunities in the right settings for certain households is really important as we pursue implementation of this policy. And I also think that we have a lack of understanding about the environmental trade-offs in some of these different policy options. We're still learning a lot about what are the environmental costs and benefits of curbside pickup, especially in rural areas with long routes and greenhouse gas emissions and fuel costs of large trucks compared to anaerobic digestion, compared to just preventing food waste from happening in the first place. So I think there's still a lot of opportunities for research in that space, especially. The cost issue is another one I'd like to bring up as an important implication. And, you know, it is great to hear that some households are able and willing to pay. And for haulers especially, I'm sure they're thinking about concentrating potential curbside programs in those areas that are more urban, densely populated, higher educated areas as well, and households with children. But again, coming back to the renters versus owners and landlords issues, if renters are the ones who want the pickup, per our research, who will pay and what's their capacity to pay? And then I do think it's important to think about low-income households in Vermont, especially in light of our current economic situation. The same survey I presented earlier on some of the results from food waste since COVID-19 was a survey about the impact of COVID-19 on unemployment and food security here in Vermont. And we found in a follow-up survey that we did of Vermonters here in Vermont in June, that 50%, more than 50% of Vermonters had experienced some type of unemployment, furlough, or loss of hours since COVID-19 in March. So we are implementing a policy in a very precarious moment in time where unfortunately many of us are hurting and many people are suffering economically. And so I do think it's something for us to think about. If there are some potential unforeseen impacts, if garbage and other costs increase, who will bear the brunt of that and how will it affect low-income households or people who may be out of work or suffering in other ways right now? So to wrap up with some 2020 and beyond conversations, a couple of things that I'm pondering, questions I'm thinking about. You know, we've made it to this point, and you know, especially for people like DEC and Josh, who indicated he'd worked on this for 8 years. I'm sure this feels like an incredible moment to have actually had this implemented. I know people were excited about it, but I would argue that we're just sort of at the beginning of even understanding what will happen. And so, as someone who studies the human behavior side of this issue, now I'm sitting around wondering, well, are people actually going to do it, and are they going to do it well? And how will that happen in a policy environment in which there is no resources or support for enforcement, and where there's still a lack of understanding for the various options that may exist? So I'm really looking forward to future data that can help us better understand, are people actually changing and diverting their food waste? Are they doing it well? What can the haulers tell us about their experiences so far in picking up curbside compost, for example? I think there's an interesting debate to be had as well about, technology or behavior change. So as someone who thinks about the human behavior side of this, it takes a lot to change people's behavior. I'm sure many of you on the Zoom realize that and know that and live that every day. And so there are opportunities to potentially enable food waste diversion with technology separations, as opposed to relying on individual people to have to separate these things out. And I think a lot of that is still expanding in our understanding of what's possible with the technologies. But I do think there is a good debate to be had, or conversations to be had, about, do we need to spend all of our time and capacity to get every single Vermonter to keep food waste out of the garbage? Or are there technology options that might help us do that? And I would also like to plug, which sounds on a call with people very interested in composting to say this, but I would like to remind everyone as well that, at least based on our research, we still need to prioritize wasting less, not just composting or diverting food waste. And so I do get worried sometimes that as we have more and more policies and regulations put in place, that people may think that we're solving the food waste problem. And we aren't necessarily solving the food waste problem simply by diverting food waste. We are still wasting food potentially, and quite a lot of food that is edible. And so when I think about the work that my team at UVM and others have done about the environmental impacts of growing food that we never actually eat in the first place, I just want to remind everyone that the top of the food waste pyramid, the inverse pyramid, really the first thing is, let's not waste food in the first place. And so I don't want to lose sight of that, even as we're thinking more and more about composting as part of this conversation. As I mentioned, I think that in 2020 and beyond, we will have hopefully a better understanding of these different trade-offs in curbside pickup, especially in rural areas versus the benefits, as more and more data and more companies come online, how they're able to make that work, what are the routes that are most efficient, and what are the economic and environmental trade-offs there. And I also think that it's critical for us to think more about not just quantity, but also quality, ensuring that it's not just getting people to even start thinking about diversion, but really making sure that their participation in these efforts are quality participation in recycling and compost and waste diversion, as opposed to just throwing whatever they want into the compost bin. And that has some really important implications for, what are we going to do with all of this compost? That is a conversation I think it's time for us to start having, because now that we're really implementing this policy, there are a lot of conversations to be had about where it goes. And so what are the needs that farmers have for compost? What are the market opportunities that composters have, new or continuing? And I give a shout out to my colleague Deb here in this particular slide, because one of the things that she's thinking a lot about, and I think is critical to this quality issue, is what are the different recipes and end uses of compost that we can have, with potentially more and more available on the landscape. How do we create compost that meets different market demands and meets different market opportunities? I know that Deb has talked about designer compost, and that there's different compost potentially that can have different benefits and be used in different ways. So these are all, I think, exciting opportunities and new areas of research for us to think about as we have more and more compost potentially coming online. It's also useful, I think, especially in light of our water quality conversations, to continue to talk about and understand the impacts of potentially more compost on the landscape. A lot of my work is also with farmers, and so I think it's important for us to better understand how farmers are thinking about using compost, and whether it's a substitution for manure or for synthetic fertilizers, or is it in addition to those things, which might prevent some nutrient loadings that may be not optimal for some of the water quality outcomes that Vermont is also trying to achieve right now. So I will end there with about 15 minutes for questions. and discussion, but I wanted to thank my colleagues at UVM, Deb Neer and Eric Roy, the Center for Rural Studies for the data collection and survey implementation of the survey that I presented most of the work on today, Casella for funding for some of this research, and then the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, especially Josh, who presented earlier. They've continued to engage with our research results, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have their perspective on these things as well. So I look forward to hearing everyone's questions, and hopefully I've given you plenty to think about on this topic. Thank you.
Meredith, thank you so much. This was really excellent content, and I think raised a lot of good conversation points. So one question we have, Meredith, that just came in is the government subsidizing any of the food scrap haulers? And that may or may not be a question for Josh as much as you.
Give that one to Josh, since he is the government.
I am the government. No, we don't subsidize any food scrap haulers. That being said, some solid waste districts or local governments in the past have really built the steady drumbeat towards the passage of Act 148 by creating a collection route for food scraps that the public sector was providing before, and now the private sector are fulfilling. So it has been done where the government has sort of stepped in and had subsidized, local governments have had subsidized collection. And some of our solid waste districts give haulers discounts on recycling bins, or like 50-50 cost shares on different types of collection containers to get the infrastructure up and running. But no, none of that is in place currently, at least not from DEC.
Yeah, I think not the haulers, but like you said, Josh, just picking up the thread in terms of some subsidized access to backyard composting tools and implementations, and training as well, I would add. There's been a lot of free, easily accessible training for backyard and community scale composting, which I think is key. Another question we have is, what are the compost or separation technologies that you referred to, I assume, Meredith, in the 2020 and beyond slide?
Yeah, maybe I'll actually just share my screen again so I can go back to things. Let's see. I think I can go back. The technologies. Oh, I think that maybe they're referring to this component here.
Yeah.
Technology or behavior change. Yeah. So I would just like to add, first of all, that this is not necessarily, the technology piece is not my area of expertise. But I do know, for example, that there are technologies and conversations with some different haulers that I've had around food depackaging, for example. So if people are throwing food in the garbage that has a lot of packaging around it, that there can be technologies that help take the food out of that packaging. Sometimes that's happening at larger commercial scale opportunities or options, but I do think that there are some ways for us to think about this problem, and there's examples of it in recycling. For example, like zero sort recycling is possible in part because of technologies that were invented to help things separate out using air and other technologies there to help just separate things themselves, right? So that's an example, I think, that has opportunities to think about what's possible with composting in that space, or food waste separation. That is there a way that we can make it easier for people, or even just prevent having to manage all of the individual level behaviors, so that people could just put things in the compost or separate things in ways that might allow for technologies on the back end to do the dirty work, pun intended. Because I do think that's one of the challenges. Our conversations, our war group with Bob Spencer down in Windham, who've been implementing a very successful curbside compost pickup program for years and years. They've gone to great lengths to improve the quality of what they get in their hauling stream. So it's still, to me, an open question, and a little bit of a philosophical one in the concept of both. Well, I think there's two sides of it. There is a very technical research side of it, of which is not my expertise. But I think on a bigger level, there is maybe a philosophical conversation to be had about how much effort should we put into making everyone do this perfectly. are there opportunities on the back end to actually better sort things or help people sort things? And I would also argue that that is true of what we refer to in sort of the academic world of my field as, I don't like the term, but laggards. So people who lag adopting a new practice. So the 33% of people, 34% of people who told us they were still going to throw their food waste in the garbage even after 2020 because for whatever reason, that's what their preference was. How much time and effort do you spend on those people? Are there opportunities then, like in different waste streams or different technologies to help separate food waste out down the road? So those are some of the things that I was referring to. But admittedly, the technology piece is not my expertise, and Eric Roy on our ROAR team would be better suited probably to help answer that question.
Thank you, Meredith. Another question we had is whether you think maybe urban residents might be more likely to participate in curbside pickup if food waste was simply another bin added to the curbside recycling pickup and covered through property taxes. So again, it's sort of, that's not exactly a technology, but it is a different way of lowering that bar and making it easier.
From everything that I know about what has made recycling successful, as well as what our survey results tell us, I'm not going to comment on how people would feel about their property taxes going up. But I do think that that would probably be, that would reduce the barrier for adoption. You create a system whereby people know when their collection is happening. They have different bins. We had from our own research data suggest that it's the people who are already using garbage as a disposal option who would be most interested in using a curbside pickup program. So presumably they're used to the process of separating their recycling and their garbage. It would be one other thing they'd have to separate, but they have sort of a familiarity with it. Those sort of procedural things are really important for changing behaviors and for potentially reducing or diverting food waste. So all of the other questions aside about the costs and the property tax increase, purely from a would that help, I think, with the behavior, then yes, I think it would, based on the research I've seen.
Great. And
Natasha, this is Josh. I just wanted to add that Brattleboro is sort of that example of success. When you put it into the property tax model, and they have achieved roughly a 60% diversion rate for the recycling and curbside compost pickup. And it was actually, I believe the story was that the hauler offered it as a way to get a longer term contract. But anyway, they've seen great success by having that as one service that comes to everybody's doorstep, essentially. So yeah, it definitely works. And then I only wanted to mention that the other technology stuff that's out there, I think Meredith brings up a lot of really good points about how do we talk about not wasting food and about composting it and feel good about composting it and also not just waste more. And I think that debate is happening, and I think it's happening in Vermont. I think it's a great microcosm for that. But I think it's not an either or, it's an all in. And to me, two studies that show that there's behaviors that people will waste more if they know compost is going to happen are valid studies. But I see so many more examples of when people start separating food waste, then they start working at a higher level of the hierarchy. They're down at the lower level for composting it at a business level or at a residential level. But then they start realizing how much they've been wasting and how much money they've been putting out there and how much they really should, the filet mignon that they bought that went, they really should plan much better. It's people don't focus on waste until they see it right in front of them separated many times. And then on the technology side, that leaves a whole openness for opportunity for entrepreneurs to set up these apps, these spoiler alerts to find cost recovery and, blending smoothies out of ugly fruit and such. So there's a lot of opportunity baked into this microcosm between not wasting and the composting of the waste. So there's a lot of stuff happening in that space. Spoiler alert is one of those companies out there innovating. So anyway, that's just
there are a lot of, thank you, Josh. There are a lot of examples of that. And before I go on to the next question, I just want to jump in with a follow-up in terms of, and I don't have data for this, so I'm curious, Meredith or Josh, if you do, But anecdotally, and of course it depends from household to household and just individual consumer patterns, but what people find when they do start either composting or diverting organics in some way is that their cost for getting rid of their garbage, for paying for pickup for garbage, goes down because it doesn't stink. There's less of it, especially if they're effectively recycling what can be recyclable. And so while there might be an added cost or an increased frequency, maybe once a week for the food scrap pickup, a lot of people who I know anecdotally say that they've gone to once a month pickup for the rest of their garbage. And so there is some balance there, but of course that varies. But so I'm just curious to either of you if you have data that, actual data that supports that.
We don't have any data that supports that. I agree with you about that, Natasha. And, I do think probably the haulers might have some interesting data about that. And it might provide an opportunity for them to also balance out their sort of economics. But Josh, I'm not sure, do you have any data from that?
Yeah, I'd look to the West Coast cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and Portland, Oregon, who basically have that model as part of the city services. You get trash, recycling, and food scrap or organics collection. And the recycling and the organics collection are more frequent than the trash. So trash may be monthly in some of those cases, but the organics is at least every other week, if not weekly, and recycling is usually every other week. So that's how they've shifted. And they, even in San Francisco, they give you a very small trash bin and they charge you for that. So it's like there is a direct incentive to use those other services. And because we know what's in the waste, I mean, the 20% of Vermont's waste that's food waste is tracks nationally as well. So this is everywhere, and it is an issue everywhere.
Yeah, great. So when thinking about some of those property taxes or how to sort of balance the budget at the end of the day, I think some of these broader considerations can come into play. So we do have another question about Meredith. How do you plan to reach or maybe Josh as well, how do you plan to reach the folks who do not want to compost and find it a burden? And are there any creative education and outreach initiatives that you're planning? So Josh, maybe this is more specifically for the state.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I sort of brought up the tone of empathy in my state remarks, and I'm still feeling that way. And so I'm feeling that way, and my team is as well, about people who are on fixed incomes or really don't have the space to compost. I mean, multiple different barriers. We get calls all the time. We don't have a silver bullet because I think everybody has a different situation. I mean, one gentleman who called me, he was 75 or plus. I found him a drop-off that was right in his own town. He just had no idea it was there. And they offer it free for residents in his town. So he's very lucky and fortunate, and he's going to start using the drop-off first thing. And he's also in an area with bears, and so that's going to be the best situation for him. It just really depends on the person. And I know, I want to just give a plug for Vermont small haulers who just their management of trash and recycling, they go way above and beyond, especially with people with disabilities. They will go into their garages and their sheds and get waste and take it out. And I think there's food scrap haulers that are now starting to do that same level of, I call it sort of a white glove service, very high bar level of service with some of these companies out there. So it's been very promising to see.
Great, thank you. And a little bit of a follow-up to that. The question is there any data on what types of waste reduction messaging, cost savings, future generations, preserving recreation spaces, et cetera, that resonate with Vermonters in particular? So has that sort of the driver question been addressed or been looked into?
Meredith, you should probably answer this.
I was going to say, I can't speak to this specific to Vermonters. What I can tell you is what the other academic research from other places says. And generally speaking I could speak a little bit to a study that we did, but generally speaking there, what's been found is that the economic story is the first one that really seems to resonate most with people. So I do think this is such an important conversation to have about the balance of cost of, materials management in general for households. It's like if your costs, and Josh is totally right, there's so much evidence to suggest that once people start composting and they visually see how much food they're wasting, they start to realize it, and then that leads to other changes. So I think that is an interesting idea of like this going up sort of the waste diversion cycle. But I would totally agree then that I think the conversations around cost savings and the balance of that in light of the potential cost savings on garbage or other things is really important. And there's a lot of good data out there about this. You know, the national data on it that's come from some big US studies is the average household is throwing away about $1,500 a year in wasted food. So, you know, real tangible dollars, both in terms of trying to prevent food waste in the first place, but then even as we think about the balance of things that do go wasted or need to be repurposed, that balance of trash versus recycling versus green waste is an interesting one. I will say though, in that space, these things, haulers think about these things, they have to think about them all together. Most of them are, looking at recycling and garbage, and now increasingly food waste as well. And there has been such a crash in the recycling market in the most recent 3 years, especially since China stopped taking our US recyclables. Why? Because they weren't clean, because people's behavior led to a situation where we just threw whatever we wanted to into the recycling bin. And that's an interesting, tale of just caution about what could happen with compost as well if there isn't like sort of some of these things in place. But from the research I've seen, it's cost savings first, and in general, some of the environmental messaging seems to resonate less than the cost savings. Although we did do a pilot study, an undergraduate student I had a few years ago with Vermont college students, off-campus college students in Burlington, and we also tested a sort of social framing around other Vermonters are doing this and you could do this too. And that actually seemed to have a little bit of an effect as well. So I think there's different ways to talk about these things, but especially in terms of where we are economically right now, I think the cost savings are a good place to start.
Great, thank you so much. I realize that we are right at 2:30, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I think this conversation, Meredith and Josh, really got a lot of, I know I have some specific ideas that I'm going to be reaching out to each of you about after the fact. And as you've both shared your contact information, I'd like to just reiterate that I think both Meredith and Josh are very open to receiving follow-up questions that maybe we didn't have time to get to today, or you can also email me directly, natasha@compostingvermont.org, and I can follow up. So we'll just keep the conversations going. This is a great start to the week lineup we have of webinars. Some of the topics that Meredith did bring up in terms of stormwater and compost use and some of these other things are going to, and hauling we do have sessions that will be specifically addressing some of these other topics. So I hope you all tune in for the rest of the week. And don't worry if you haven't registered for all of them and you've decided you want to participate in more. The links are all available. And thank you, everyone, and Meredith and Josh and Commissioner Walke for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.